Good evening and welcome to Swing States. As we get closer to Election Day, just 40 days left, we continue to bring back some candidates for a second bite of the apple to see how their campaigns have developed. And tonight we have Democratic candidate for North Carolina's 9th Congressional District, which includes much of Guilford and Chatham County, all of Guilford and Chatham counties, or much of them, plus all of Alamance, Randolph, and Moore counties. That candidate is Nigel Bristow. Welcome back to the show. Good to have you back. Fair to say there's a whole lot new excitement on the Democratic side.
Oh, yes, very. The fact that VP Harris is on the top of the ticket has created quite a movement.
Well, you were at the convention back in July, so give me a sense of what that was like.
It was just full of energy. It was clear that something, had emerged and that we were just seeing the beginning back then.
There's a lot of talk, though, about whether this is excitement about Vice President Harris, or is it excitement that we're not having to deal with the situation President Biden put the party in?
Well, from what I feel and what I've seen, especially out in the community, it's more of excitement about VP Harris and what she brings and her nuances and, her record and what she's looking to do for the people of the country.
Well, let's talk about some of that. What are you hearing people say about the Vice President as you campaign?
That pretty much that she's for the people, that her whole history of her life that has been about that, from her being a district attorney to being a state attorney general and of course the VP.
Yeah, and you, for people who may not be familiar, Mr. Bristow was a detective with the New York City Police Department for 20 years, right?
Correct.
So you know a little bit about dealing with crime.
Yes.
And what works and what doesn't. We can talk about a little more of that in down the road here tonight. What about her choice for Vice President, Tim Walz?
I think it's an excellent choice. He's down to earth. I mean, a school teacher, a coach. He was a congressperson, governor, and his record as governor was excellent. The fact that he advocated for and got free school lunch, so he's about education and about children. So I think he's an excellent choice.
He had some issues, speaking of situations of violence and crime, where when Minneapolis was burning largely after the George Floyd killing, he let it burn for a few days before he called on the National Guard. That he's been criticized for that to some degree. You've, I'm sure, looked at that. What should we know about all that?
Well, sometimes it's not easy for someone, the governor, to call in the National Guard, especially if things are still hot. You try to mediate as best as you can, try to get community organizers and try to get the community together and come to a common ground. Sometimes if people see it as you're sending the troops in, now that's going to up their level of, violence perhaps, whereas he may have been trying to let things simmer down and try to work some negotiations behind the table.
So you've been out there on the campaign trail for months now. We last spoke with you in early May. What's changed from what you see out there? What are you hearing? What are you seeing? What are people telling you?
Well, what I'm seeing is more community engagement, more volunteers, more door knocking. People are calling, they're emailing, they're writing. What can we do to help? What can we do to help your campaign, as well as what can we do to help the VP Harris campaign?
And to what degree do you think enthusiasm for the vice president trickles down to congressional level?
Well, the bottom line is, in order for VP Harris, once elected, to be successful, she's going to have to be able to have the cooperation and work with the Congress. So that, pretty much says that, people understand that, okay, we need a Democratic Congress if we have VP Harris as the president, because we saw what happened in the second Obama term. When the Republicans controlled the House, there was very little he can get done by way of Congress.
Well, right. To some degree, it comes down to compromising too, though. Each side saying, all right, if you want A, B, and C, I'm going to need D, E, and F, and let's find a way to blend that. A lot of times both parties get stuck in this thing where they want it all. And their idea of bipartisanship is you agreeing with me. It's too often what happens, it seems like. And again, this is not exclusive to either party. It seems like politicians do it across the board. Do you get that sense at all that both parties are sort of like, agree with me or I'm not going to deal with you?
It's more like you have one party, and I'm just going to say it from what I've seen.
Okay.
The Republican Party, the hardliners, they'll be to a point where they won't even bring things to the floor for a vote. And that goes contrary to the people that sent them there to represent them in the first place. Whereas the Democratic Party, we're for the people. So, in order for us to get successful legislation that'll benefit all Americans, we need, yes, that compromise. But if the Republicans are in charge of the House and they don't bring the measure to the floor for a vote, then whose interest gets served? Certainly not the people.
What is going to win this election going to mean for you?
Well, it's going to mean a lot of work. It's going to be a lot of work.
But you're used to that.
Yes, but it's going to be on a grander scale. A lot of excitement. I'm looking forward to, because all my life I've been working for people and doing things for community, and now to be able to do it at such a wider scale now, and it's just going to be, it's going to be incredible.
What's the one thing you hear most when you talk to voters?
Well, they want to know, why should I vote for you? What have you done prior to you running for election? What have you done to help the community?
And your answer is?
Well, my answer is it starts right from the police department.
Yeah.
20 years in the police department, serving the people of the city of New York. And when I started as a cop, I started as a beat cop.
Okay.
So I was actually in those neighborhoods, and during the early 90s when crime was, pretty much.
Peaked.
Yes. Yeah. And working with the community, identifying issues, finding those resources to help deal with those level of crimes. And then it goes on, working in the school system. I substitute taught in the high school that I graduated from. So again, that's me working with education, and to my current occupation and my involvement with the different community-based resources. So my whole life has been about listening to, defending, protecting of, and helping people.
Very good. We have a lot more to talk about tonight, including getting a little deeper into Mr. Bristow's policy positions now that he's had a few months on the campaign trail talking to voters. That's next. Welcome back to Swing State. Tonight we have the Democratic candidate for North Carolina's 9th Congressional District, Nigel Bristow, with us. We said we would get into some of your policy issues a little more deeply. I want to go through a few of them. You say that one by one our rights and freedoms guaranteed by the Constitution are being stripped away, and that we are at a crossroads for that. So what do you mean by that?
All right, let's take it, gerrymandering, for example. The state of North Carolina has gerrymandered the district so much that they make it extremely difficult for Democrats to win an election. And so one of the John Lewis Voting Act,
Voting Rights Act, yeah.
that was voted against, and that would have protected or prevented that from happening. And as well as, we could talk about Roe v. Wade being overturned, the fact that the state of North Carolina refuses to fund the public schools as they're mandated by the state constitution. So.
Well, let me push back on a couple of those. With education, the Constitution says shall provide an adequate, or I forget what the exact term is. It doesn't say how much has to be spent.
Right, but the Leandro decision indicated that the state needed to pay for the schools.
Well, it does. You mean pay more.
Right.
Pay to a certain level, and that continues to be litigated years down the road. You also have said that as a person of color, I remain committed to the racial justice and the creation of harassment-free spaces. Elaborate on that a little bit, what that means.
Well, pretty much that, for example, the fact that there's no labor unions in the state. And I know, it's a state issue, but it's something that a representative could, assist with no protections in the workplace. And then, that's something that the workers need.
Well, as a right-to-work state, what that says is you're not required to join a union. For example, my brother, when we grew up in Chicago, he wanted to be an electrician. He was required to join a union, as opposed to you don't have a choice. Whereas in North Carolina, you can join a union if you want to create one, but you're not required to. And so I think some people would say the freedom is on the choice to join or not join.
Well, not according to the community and the people I speak to. Their employers won't allow it, and they won't have them come in.
Well, yeah, they've got to be voted in and organized, but there is certainly pushback from a lot of owners on whether their employees should vote to unionize. When you mention harassment-free spaces, we've seen what's going on in a lot of campuses, mostly in the Northeast and some in the upper Midwest, with Jewish students and the pro-Palestinian demonstrators. Would they fall under that, creating an area for them to not be harassed?
Exactly, because students, just like everyone else, they have a right to protest respectfully and peacefully. So when that's infringed, we all lose.
Right, but I'm saying the protesters are creating harassment for the Jewish students who just want to go about their life.
Well, there has to be some kind of mitigation and some kind of compromise, and it has to be monitored. Like, for example, there has to be an avenue where a peaceful protest can take place without infringing upon the rights of the other students, just trying to get their education.
You also list environmental justice as one of your top issues. How do we define that?
Well, as far as, climate change is a real thing. So just those organizations or those entities to make sure that they're regulated so that they do what they can to reduce, pollution controls and things like that.
You mentioned in our last discussion that even if it costs young people their jobs, you support a higher minimum wage, even perhaps a living wage as it's described. Have you heard anything as you campaign about that might have made you think twice about that?
No, I think that people still need a living wage. No county in the country are you able to, live with $7.25 an hour. You need a living wage.
But those jobs aren't meant to support a family.
It doesn't matter, because what we see time and time again, many employers base their salaries on the minimum wage. So if the minimum wage is only $7.25, that's where they're going to start.
What do we do then when those jobs get automated away and the kids don't have any option to develop skills in the workplace?
There's always going to be options. If we increase the funding for education and the kids are able to learn other skills, there'll be jobs available.
Okay. You call for additional funding for a variety of things, including, as you just mentioned, education, child care, high-speed internet, free community college for seniors. That's a bunch of money. Where does the money come from?
Well, that would be something we have to evaluate, because we want to try to make the budget, but at times, it'll call for, you may have to, for example, protecting Social Security, perhaps raising the cap on the Social Security. That way, Social Security will become solvent for years to come. So we have to look at different nuances to be able to identify where that funding will come from.
Yeah, I think that's, to me, is the easy one that I'm shocked hasn't been done yet, is if you just eliminate the cap on Social Security tax, it's solvent as far as the eye can see.
That's right.
Now, that still leaves a lot of other things. Excuse me, allergy season still lingering on with me. Medicare, Medicaid are still running huge deficits, and we've got other deficits to come, and we're already $33 trillion in debt. The budget has to be cut. I'm not sure where you cut it.
Well, another thing you look at is fair taxes for all. And that means, the top 1%, increasing the taxes up there, increasing the corporate tax to an extent. All those things would have to be looked at.
Yeah, have to be looked at, maybe not implemented. I know when we last had a corporate tax of 28%, which is what Vice President Harris is advocating, we lost about 20, 30 corporations a year that would just headquarter elsewhere, because we would be one of the highest tax countries in the G20, and these people vote with their feet then, and they leave, and then we lose all that tax. So you got to wonder, what level are you getting counterproductive when you increase it? Because companies aren't just going to sit there and say, okay, you want more of my money, here it is.
All right, well, there may have to be further negotiations to maybe offer some other type of incentive to try to mitigate that a little bit.
Yeah, okay. We want to talk about personal income taxes in a second a little bit, but If one of those things is more of a priority than the other, the funding for education, childcare, internet community colleges, is there one that really stands out to you?
Well, education and healthcare are a very top priority, because especially education, because we know that the school to prison pipeline is a real thing. So if children don't have access to a adequate and appropriate education, it could lead to a dark path.
Often where it ends up, unfortunately, you're right. All right, still more we want to get into tonight, including some statewide races that might be on your radar. Welcome back to Swing State. Tonight we have welcomed Democratic candidate Nigel Bristow back for a second session with us. He was last here back in early May. You mentioned in the last segment taxes and maybe how they need to be increased on the top 1%. Bottom half of income earners, so from 50% down, pay 2.3% of income taxes. The top 1% pays nearly 46%. The top 10% of income earners pay more than 75% of all income taxes. How much more can you tax them? Because like I said, the bottom half is essentially not paying.
Well, I think they would disagree with you based on what their income is. And that would have to be adjusted based on what the earnings are.
Well, the top 10% earns 52% of the income and pays a little more than 75% of the taxes. And so I think what ends up happening at some point is when you get more than, and we're pretty close to having half of all Americans paying no income tax, then the income tax are never going to be adjusted, because when you have 51% paying nothing, they're never going to vote for the taxes to be increased. And you've got a majority there. I worry about a system where, again, these people who have the money they'll find ways to avoid paying taxes, whether they move to another country, whether they find other ways. The challenge becomes there's a certain point at which the people who have all that money are going to say no more. Are you worried about that at all? Then sort of going on strike, so to speak?
It's a deep concern, and like I said, it's something that we have to look at and has to be evaluated and come to some type of compromise.
Vice President Harris has been on the record for what is called a mandatory buyback of guns. Specifically guns beyond pistols. You said last time you were here that people should be licensed. What would a system like that look like? And would you be for a mandatory buyback which says all these types of guns are no longer legal, you must sell them back to the government?
I wouldn't be opposed to it, because we've had similar programs like that in New York when I was a police officer, and they were very successful. At the end of the day, you want to try to get those dangerous weapons off the street. And if that leads to less guns on the street, then that's a good thing.
Are you as opposed to someone just having a pistol for safety as someone who might have a repeating rifle?
Well, assault weapons and weapons like that, which some people consider weapons of mass destruction, are a danger to all Americans. So that versus a handgun, that would be the preference. But a buyback is a buyback, no matter what type of weapon.
When you were an officer, you were working with, for a while at least, I'm sure, a Republican mayor in Rudy Giuliani. Did you find people could work together? People who are Democrats, Republicans found a way to get it all done? Because that's when crime reduced.
Yes, because the fact that the common denominator was the crime, and people wanted to get it down, and they wanted to be safe in the streets. So,
and it worked.
Yes, and as you can see, New York City did get cleaned up. To his credit, Mayor Giuliani, with our help, of course, we were able to get those crime numbers down and make people safe. And
you guys are on the front line, but you also need the person in the mayor's office working with you.
Yes.
Last time you were here, we also talked about the war between Israel and Gaza, and you said that people were dying, so something has to be done. I'm wondering if you have a better idea of what that might be now that you've had a few months of campaigning under your belt.
Well, the hostages have to be returned. There needs to be a ceasefire, and the killing has to stop.
And they've, of course, been working on a ceasefire for a while now. But do you leave Hamas in place to any degree, or does Israel have a right to eliminate Hamas completely so that the cancer, so to speak, doesn't come back?
Well, it's hard to say, because Hamas is the Palestinians' government.
Yeah.
So to advocate for one government to overthrow another government, there's no winner in that.
I promised that we would talk something about some statewide races here, so I need to bring up about our gubernatorial race in North Carolina. There is an African American on the Republican side in that race. What do you think about that race?
Well, from everything I see, especially I'm out in the community going door to door, people like Josh Stein. Mm-hmm. They like his values. They do not like the other guy's extreme, talking points and things like that.
As a former police officer, I need to ask about prosecutions. There are district attorneys across the country who are refusing to prosecute entire classes of crimes. They will say, well, we don't prosecute misdemeanors, and then they raise the definition of petty larceny to anything under $1,000. We've seen some wild shoplifting going on across the country because of this. Really, it's just outright theft is exploding. What do you think about that as someone who wants to enforce the law?
Well, there's no doubt that we need criminal justice reform, but we have to draw the line somewhere, because these business owners, especially in a situation like you described, they're being taken to the cleaners.
Mm-hmm.
They're losing everything, and we have to draw the line somewhere. When it gets to the point where we can't allow chaos in the streets. So again, the business owners, they pay taxes. They have a right to be able to operate their business and not have to worry about being ripped off.
So are you worried then about that trend of district attorneys who just say, well, I'm just not going to prosecute that?
Right, and see, with that, a district attorney is an elected position, so
Yeah.
it would be up to the people in that community to say and push back on that.
Yeah.
And then, someone to maybe, run for that office and put that person out.
Do we put too much focus on race in this country? Because you and I share 99% of the same experiences in life, I would think, or pretty close to it.
I mean, race is a thing, it's a big thing, but as far as too much of it, I don't see it.
No. Do we put enough then, emphasis on race? Because, we're trying to find ways to bind together 330 million people as opposed to find ways to separate us.
Well, we have to be sensitive to everyone's needs. In order for us to live and work together, we have to be able to, compromise and work together.
Okay, just got a second or so left. You're going to win this race?
Yes.
Very good. I love that confidence. Well, that's it for tonight. Remember, we're not just a TV show, we're a podcast as well. Just search Swing State wherever you get your podcasts. But if you prefer this TV version and can't stay up this late on Sundays, remember that you can record the show through the magic of the DVR. See you next time.